He was simply sorting through his grandmother's belongings after she passed away and inherited an old mini Statue of Liberty. Nothing special, just an ordinary souvenir from the past. But one day, he noticed a strange sealed seam at the base. When the man finally decided to open it and look inside, he realized why this statue had been so carefully guarded for decades. What he discovered turned out to be a secret capable of changing not only his life, but the history of an entire town. Subscribe and write in the comments which city or country you're watching from. Michael Turner had never thought of himself as a man tied to the past. He lived a simple, orderly life shaped by routines rather than memories. At 37, he worked as a maintenance supervisor in a mid-sized logistics company, spending most of his days fixing things that were broken and organizing problems that other people preferred to ignore. His apartment was modest and practical, furnished with items chosen for usefulness instead of sentiment. He was not the type to keep souvenirs or old letters, and he rarely looked back on the years that had already passed. Life, as far as he was concerned, was something to be managed efficiently, one day at a time. Yet, there had always been one part of his life that felt different from the rest, a quiet corner of his childhood that never fully made sense to him. That corner belonged to his grandparents. They had raised him for long stretches when his parents were busy working double shifts, and he remembered their house with a mixture of warmth and unease. It had been a place of strict rules, polished floors, and carefully arranged furniture. Nothing was ever out of place there. Even as a boy, Michael understood that his grandparents valued order above almost everything else. What he never understood was their strange devotion to a single object. On a small wooden stand in the living room, behind a locked glass case, stood a miniature metal version of the Statue of Liberty. It was not large, barely taller than a man's forearm, but it dominated the room in a way that none of the other decorations ever did. Whenever guests came to visit, his grandmother would dust the case with unusual care, and his grandfather would glance at it as though silently making sure it was still there. As a child, Michael had once tried to touch it. He remembered being no more than 9 years old, reaching out in innocent curiosity while his grandmother was in the kitchen. The reaction had been immediate and sharp. His grandfather's voice had stopped him like a wall, firm and unyielding, telling him to step away and never touch it again. No explanation had followed. From that day on, Michael understood that the statue was not a toy, not even an ordinary decoration. It was something else entirely. Over the years, he learned to accept that some questions were simply not welcome in that house. His grandparents loved him. He never doubted that, but their affection came with invisible boundaries. They were private people, shaped by experiences they rarely spoke about. Whenever Michael asked about the statue, his grandmother would gently change the subject, and his grandfather would grow quiet in a way that discouraged further conversation. Eventually, Michael stopped asking. Time moved forward, as it always does. Michael grew up, found work, moved out, and built a life that had little to do with the careful, guarded world of his childhood. Visits to his grandparents became less frequent, but always warm. They aged gracefully, their routines never changing, their house remaining exactly as he remembered it. The little metal statue stayed in its glass case, untouched and untouchable. The call informing him of their passing came on a gray Monday morning. First his grandmother, peacefully in her sleep, and only a few months later his grandfather, as if he had decided not to stay behind in a world without her. Michael handled the arrangements the way he handled everything else, with quiet responsibility. He organized the funeral, sorted through papers, and helped clear out a lifetime of belongings. It was only when he stood alone in their familiar living room that the full weight of their absence finally settled over him. Among the many items listed in the will, one detail caught his attention. The house was to be sold, the furniture donated, and most of the personal effects divided among distant relatives. But the miniature Statue of Liberty was left specifically to him, mentioned by name and described with surprising precision. The document included its dimensions, its approximate age, and even a note stating that it should remain intact and unopened. That last word stayed with Michael long after he finished reading. He tried to remember a single conversation in which his grandparents had explained why they wanted him to have it. There were none. The statue had always been present, yet never discussed. Now, suddenly, it was his responsibility. In the weeks that followed, Michael spent evenings packing boxes and sorting through decades of memories that were not truly his. Old photographs, yellowed letters, and carefully folded clothes passed through his hands. The house felt emptier each time he visited. On the final day, when the movers carried out the last pieces of furniture, only the glass case remained in the living room. Inside it, as always, stood the statue. Up close, it looked different from the way he remembered. The metal surface was darker, marked by faint scratches and tiny imperfections that suggested age rather than neglect. It was heavier than he expected when he finally lifted it from the stand. The base felt unusually solid, almost too solid for something meant to be decorative. Michael wrapped it carefully in soft cloth and placed it in a separate box, treating it with more respect than he gave to anything else he had inherited. He told himself he was doing it out of loyalty to his grandparents, out of a desire to honor their wishes. But beneath that reasonable explanation was another feeling he did not quite want to admit: curiosity. Driving back to his apartment with the statue secured on the passenger seat, he kept glancing at it as though it were capable of speaking. The city moved past his windows in familiar patterns, yet everything felt slightly altered, as if he were carrying home not just an object but a question that had been waiting for him his entire life. That evening, after the last of the boxes had been brought inside, Michael cleared a space on his dining table and carefully unwrapped the statue. In the bright light of his apartment, away from the protective glass case, it looked less like a family heirloom and more like a mystery. He turned it slowly in his hands, noticing details he had never seen before. The craftsmanship was better than he had assumed, precise and deliberate. It was not the kind of trinket one bought in a tourist shop. As he examined the base, something caught his eye. Along the underside ran a thin, almost invisible line, a seam so fine that it could easily be mistaken for part of the design. Michael frowned and traced it with his finger. The metal on one side felt slightly different from the other, as though two separate pieces had been joined together long ago. He set the statue down and leaned back in his chair, staring at it. A memory surfaced of his grandmother polishing the base with special care, always turning it away from view when she finished. At the time, he had assumed it was simply her meticulous nature. Now, he was not so sure. The longer he looked at the statue, the more questions formed in his mind. Why had his grandparents guarded it so fiercely? Why had the will included such specific instructions? And why did the base appear to have been altered? Michael was not a man prone to fanciful theories. He preferred simple explanations to complicated ones. Yet, as he sat alone in his quiet apartment, surrounded by the remnants of his grandparents' lives, He felt the first stirrings of something he had never associated with himself before. A need to know. He told himself he would place the statue on a shelf and forget about it. He told himself it was only an object, a sentimental keepsake, nothing more. But even as he thought those reasonable thoughts, his eyes kept returning to that barely visible seam. Outside, the city settled into night, cars passing like distant waves beyond his window. Michael finally rose, switched off the overhead light, and left the statue standing alone on the table. From the doorway, he looked back at it one last time. In the dim glow of the room, it seemed almost alive, as though waiting patiently for him to make the next move. For the first time since receiving the inheritance, Michael understood something important. Whatever the statue truly was, it had been protected for a reason. And now, whether he wanted it or not, that reason had become his to uncover. For several days after bringing the statue into his apartment, Michael tried to convince himself that nothing unusual had happened. He placed it on a small shelf near the window, where the afternoon light touched it softly, and went back to his ordinary routines. He went to work, answered emails, fixed broken machinery, and returned home tired enough to avoid deep thoughts. On the surface, life continued exactly as it had before. Yet something invisible had shifted. The statue was now part of his daily environment, and he could not stop noticing it. In the evenings, when the apartment grew quiet and the sounds of the city faded into a distant hum, his eyes would drift toward it almost against his will. He would sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and feel the weight of that small metal figure across the room as if it were quietly demanding attention. He told himself he was imagining things. Objects did not hold secrets. They did not call out to be examined, and yet the feeling remained. One night, unable to sleep, he finally gave in to the curiosity he had been trying to ignore. He carried the statue back to the table and placed it under a bright desk lamp, determined to look at it with calm, practical logic. He was a man who solved problems for a living. Surely, this was no different. Under strong light, the details became clearer than ever before. The surface of the metal was worn in places, polished smooth where fingers had touched it over many years. The torch, held high in the statue's right hand, showed tiny scratches, as though someone had carefully cleaned it again and again. None of that seemed particularly strange. What drew his attention, as it had before, was the base. Michael turned the statue upside down and studied the underside closely. The seam he had noticed earlier was still there, running in a perfect, thin circle near the edge. It was so precise that at first glance it looked intentional, like part of the original design. But the more he examined it, the more he doubted that explanation. The line was too clean, too deliberate, and slightly uneven in color compared to the rest of the metal. He ran his fingertip along it slowly, feeling a faint difference in texture. On one side, the metal was cool and smooth. On the other, it felt slightly rougher, as if coated with something that had hardened long ago. He fetched a magnifying glass from a drawer and peered through it, searching for any sign that might explain what he was seeing. The magnified view only deepened the mystery. Traces of an old adhesive clung to the seam, darkened with age. In a few places, tiny bubbles had formed, as though heat or pressure had once been applied. It did not look like ordinary wear and tear. It looked like a deliberate seal. Michael sat back in his chair and folded his arms. A practical part of his mind tried to find simple explanations. Perhaps the base had been repaired at some point. Maybe the statue had broken years ago, and someone had carefully glued it back together. That seemed reasonable enough, but if that were true, why had his grandparents treated it with such extreme caution? Why had they guarded it as though it were fragile beyond measure? He searched the internet for similar statues, scrolling through pages of antique dealers and collectors. Hundreds of miniature statues of liberty appeared on his screen, made of bronze, copper, and cheap painted metal. None of them had a seam like the one he was staring at. Their bases were solid, cast in a single piece. The more he compared images, the more convinced he became that his statue was different from the rest. An ordinary person might have stopped there, satisfied that the object was simply unusual. Michael, however, had never been good at leaving puzzles unsolved. He fetched a small measuring tape and recorded the exact dimensions of the base. Then he weighed the statue on his kitchen scale, frowning at the result. It was heavier than it should have been for its size. The difference was slight, but noticeable. He tapped gently on the base with the handle of a screwdriver and listened carefully. The upper part of the statue produced a clear metallic ring, thin and bright. The base, however, answered with a dull, hollow thud. The contrast was obvious enough that even an untrained ear could hear it. Something about that base was not solid at all. For a long time, Michael simply stared at the statue, turning it in his hands and thinking about the people who had once owned it. He remembered his grandmother dusting the glass case with almost ritual precision. He remembered his grandfather glancing at it before leaving the house, as though silently checking on an old friend. None of those memories fit with the idea of a simple, decorative object. A restless energy began to grow inside him. He imagined the statue sitting in that locked case year after year, untouched, silently carrying whatever mystery it held. The thought that his grandparents had lived with that secret every day filled him with a mixture of respect and frustration. Why had they never trusted him enough to explain? Unable to resist, Michael reached for a thin metal pick from his toolbox and carefully pressed it against the seam. He did not intend to force anything open. He only wanted to see whether the line was truly as solid as it appeared. The tool slipped slightly, meeting firm resistance. He tried again from a different angle with the same result. Whatever sealed that base had been applied with serious intention. He set the tool aside, feeling suddenly uneasy. Breaking open a family heirloom felt wrong, almost disrespectful, yet leaving the mystery alone felt equally impossible. The statue was no longer just an object to him. It had become a question, and Michael had never been comfortable living with unanswered questions. Over the next few days, he found himself examining it again and again, always returning to that stubborn seam. He tested it gently with different tools, applying only the lightest pressure, but nothing changed. The seal was as hard as stone. It occurred to him that his grandparents might have chosen a method specifically designed to prevent curious hands from prying inside. That thought troubled him more than he expected. What reason could they possibly have had for going to such lengths? He began to imagine possibilities, each more unlikely than the last. Perhaps something valuable was hidden inside. Old coins, jewelry, or important papers. Perhaps it was something dangerous, something they had wanted to keep out of the wrong hands. The more he considered these ideas, the more restless he became. One evening, he took the statue with him to his couch and held it in his lap like a strange, silent companion. He studied the face of Lady Liberty, calm and unchanging, and wondered how many years she had stood watch over secrets no one else knew. For the first time, he felt a flicker of fear. Curiosity was one thing. Opening a door that had been deliberately locked for decades was something else entirely. Michael considered calling a professional restorer and asking for advice, but hesitated. He was not ready to share the statue with strangers yet, not until he understood more about it himself. At the same time, he knew that forcing it open without knowledge or experience would be foolish. If something truly important lay inside, he did not want to destroy it through impatience. Late one night, while searching online for information about antique repairs, he came across an article about hidden compartments in historical objects. Collectors sometimes concealed documents or valuables inside hollow spaces, sealing them so carefully that only special equipment could reveal their presence. The article mentioned the use of X-ray scanners to examine such items without causing damage. Michael read the paragraph several times, feeling a slow realization form in his mind. If he could see inside the statue without opening it, he would finally know whether his suspicions were justified. It was a logical solution, cautious and sensible. Exactly the kind of approach he preferred. The idea refused to leave him. He began thinking of people he knew who might have access to that kind of equipment. A former co-worker now worked at a small medical supply company. Another acquaintance repaired industrial machinery and sometimes used scanning tools to inspect metal parts. The more he considered it, the more possible it seemed. Still, he hesitated. Taking such a step would mean admitting that the statue was more than a sentimental keepsake. It would mean treating it like evidence in an investigation. He was not sure he was ready for that. Yet, every time he passed the shelf and saw the statue standing there in quiet dignity, he felt the same familiar pull. The seam on the base seemed to stare back at him, a thin, silent challenge. His grandparents had protected this object for most of their lives. Now it belonged to him. Ignoring it felt almost like betraying them. At last, Michael accepted what he had been avoiding from the beginning. He was not going to forget about the statue. He was not going to place it in a corner and pretend it was ordinary. Whatever truth it held, he needed to know it. One rainy evening, he carried the statue back to the table and set it down with careful determination. The decision had finally been made. Before he attempted anything else, before he even considered breaking that ancient seal, he would find a way to look inside safely. As he turned off the lights and prepared for bed, the plan already forming in his mind, Michael felt a strange mixture of excitement and apprehension. The first chapter of his inheritance had ended with questions. The next, he knew, would bring answers. And once he saw what was hidden within that heavy metal base, there would be no turning back. By the time Michael reached a clear decision to investigate the statue properly, he already felt as though he had crossed an invisible line. Curiosity had turned into determination, and determination had begun to shape his daily thoughts. What once had been a quiet object on a shelf now occupied an uncomfortable amount of space in his mind. He caught himself thinking about it during work meetings, while driving, even while lying awake at night. The seam on the base, so thin and unassuming, had become impossible to ignore. Still, he was careful by nature, and caution kept him from rushing forward blindly. Before doing anything drastic, he wanted to be certain he was not making a mistake. Opening a sealed family heirloom without understanding its background felt reckless. There were also practical concerns. If something truly important was hidden inside, he needed to handle it in a way that would not damage it or create legal trouble. The last thing he wanted was to destroy evidence of something valuable through impatience. He began by trying to understand his options. In the evenings, he researched online what people did when they discovered hidden compartments in old objects. The answers were not simple. Some recommended professional restorers, others suggested contacting museums, and a few warned of legal complications if the contents turned out to belong to someone else. The more Michael read, the more he realized that this situation might be more serious than he had originally imagined. One afternoon, during his lunch break, he decided to seek real advice instead of relying on anonymous internet forums. There was a small antique shop not far from his workplace, a narrow store squeezed between a bakery and a dry cleaner, filled with dusty furniture and glass cases of old trinkets. Michael had walked past it countless times without ever going inside. Now, carrying the carefully wrapped statue in a padded bag, he pushed open the door and stepped into a world that smelled of old wood and forgotten years. The owner was an older man with silver hair and calm, patient eyes. He greeted Michael politely and listened as he explained in vague terms that he had inherited a small metal statue and wanted an expert opinion. Michael avoided mentioning the sealed compartment at first. He simply placed the statue on the counter and asked whether the man could tell him anything about it. The antique dealer examined it with professional interest. He turned it slowly under a bright lamp, studying the details of the figure, the craftsmanship of the torch, and the weight of the metal. He commented that it was better made than most souvenir replicas and suggested it might date back several decades, possibly even earlier. When he reached the base, however, his expression changed slightly. He ran a finger along the faint seam, leaned closer, and frowned. Without asking for permission, he fetched a small magnifying tool and inspected the area more carefully. Michael watched him with growing tension, trying not to reveal how important this moment felt. The man eventually looked up and said in a thoughtful tone that the base did not appear to be original. It looked, he explained, as though someone had modified it after the statue was made. The seam was too deliberate, the adhesive too carefully applied. He had seen similar techniques used to hide compartments in old clocks and jewelry boxes. When Michael asked what that might mean, the dealer shrugged and said it could mean many things. Sometimes people hid valuables. Sometimes they hid documents. And sometimes, he added quietly, they hid things they were afraid of. Those words stayed with Michael long after he left the shop. On the drive home, he considered everything he had heard. The idea that the base had been deliberately altered confirmed his suspicions. At the same time, it raised new questions. Who had done it? When? And for what purpose? His grandparents had owned the statue for as long as he could remember, but that did not necessarily mean they were the ones who had created the secret compartment. That evening, he returned to his grandparents' house, which still had not been fully cleared out. He walked through the quiet rooms with a new perspective, searching for anything that might offer clues. He opened drawers he had ignored before, flipped through old address books, and examined stacks of yellowed letters. Most of what he found was ordinary family history, recipes, holiday cards, and faded photographs. Yet even ordinary objects now felt potentially significant. In a small desk in the spare bedroom, he discovered a box of neatly organized documents. Among them were old insurance papers, property records, and a few pages that mentioned the statue specifically. One sheet appeared to be an appraisal from many years earlier, but the final value had been torn away, leaving only the description behind. The missing information unsettled him. It suggested that someone had intentionally removed details they did not want others to see. Michael also found a pair of soft cotton gloves tucked carefully into a drawer, along with a small bottle of metal polish. He remembered his grandmother using similar gloves whenever she cleaned the glass case. At the time, he had assumed she was simply being careful. Now, he wondered whether she had been protecting something far more important than a decorative figure. As he continued searching, he began to form theories in his mind. Perhaps the statue contained jewelry or savings hidden during difficult times. Perhaps it held letters that someone wanted kept private. There were darker possibilities as well. What if the compartment contained something illegal or dangerous? The thought made him uneasy, but he could not dismiss it. Over the next few days, Michael found himself caught between two strong impulses. Part of him wanted to break the seal immediately and discover the truth. Another part warned him to slow down, to think carefully before taking irreversible steps. He was not an impulsive man, and experience had taught him that rushing into unknown situations rarely ended well. He tried once more to open the base gently, using thin tools and steady pressure, but the seal remained unyielding. The hardened adhesive seemed almost part of the metal itself. Each failed attempt only strengthened his belief that brute force was not the answer. Whatever lay inside deserved better treatment. Eventually, he reached the conclusion he had been circling from the beginning. If he wanted to know what was hidden inside the statue without destroying it, he needed a way to see through the metal. The idea of using specialized scanning equipment returned to him with renewed urgency. Finding someone willing to help was not as simple as he hoped. When he mentioned the idea to a few acquaintances, most of them reacted with confusion or mild amusement. To them, the statue was just an old ornament, not worth the trouble he was suggesting. Michael learned quickly that explaining his feelings about it only made him sound slightly obsessive. Then he remembered a former co-worker named Daniel, who had recently taken a job at a small engineering company. Daniel had once mentioned that they used industrial imaging tools to inspect machinery for internal flaws. Michael had not spoken to him in years, but desperation pushed him to make contact. They met for coffee on a Saturday morning, and Michael carefully described the situation without revealing too many personal details. He spoke of an inherited object, a suspicious seam, and his desire to examine it safely. To his relief, Daniel listened with genuine interest instead of skepticism. He explained that their equipment was capable of scanning dense materials and might be able to reveal whether the base contained anything unusual. For the first time since the mystery began, Michael felt a sense of progress. Still, doubts lingered. What if the scan revealed nothing at all? What if he was chasing a fantasy built from childhood memories and grief? He tried to prepare himself for disappointment, yet deep down he believed there was something there. Too many small details pointed in the same direction. In the days leading up to the planned scan, he found himself studying the statue more carefully than ever. He imagined his grandparents holding it, guarding it, choosing never to speak about it. He wondered what burden they had carried and whether they had ever intended for him to uncover it after they were gone. At work, he became distracted, counting the hours until he would finally know the truth. His colleagues noticed his unusual silence but assumed he was simply dealing with the aftermath of his grandparents' passing. In a way, they were right, though they could not have guessed how complicated that aftermath had become. The night before the appointment, Michael sat alone in his apartment with the statue resting on the table between his hands. He felt a strange mixture of anticipation and fear. If the scan showed an empty base, the mystery would end and life would return to normal. But if it revealed something hidden, everything would change. There would be no more pretending that the statue was just a harmless keepsake. He considered, not for the first time, the possibility that his grandparents had kept the secret for a reason. Perhaps they had wanted it to die with them. Perhaps opening the compartment would expose truths better left buried. The thought weighed heavily on him, yet he knew he could not turn back now. Michael had always believed that honesty mattered, even when it was uncomfortable. If his family had been connected to something important, he owed it to them to understand what it was. Secrets, he told himself, had a way of shaping lives whether people faced them or not. As he prepared for bed, he placed the statue back on its shelf and stood looking at it in the dim light. The familiar figure seemed unchanged, yet Michael felt as though he was seeing it for the first time. It was no longer merely a reminder of his grandparents. It had become a doorway waiting to be opened. Tomorrow, he knew, that doorway would finally reveal what lay on the other side. And once he stepped through it, there would be no returning to the simple certainty he had known before. The morning of the scan arrived with a feeling Michael could not quite name. It was not simple excitement, nor pure anxiety, but something balanced carefully between the two. For weeks he had lived with uncertainty, circling around the mystery of the statue without truly touching it. Now, at last, he was about to take a step that would provide answers, whether he was ready for them or not. He woke earlier than usual, unable to sleep past dawn. The statue waited on the kitchen table where he had placed it the night before, wrapped once again in soft cloth. In the pale light of morning, it looked smaller than he remembered, almost ordinary. If a stranger had seen it, they would have assumed it was nothing more than a decorative object. Only Michael knew how much weight it truly carried. After a quick breakfast, he packed it carefully into a padded case he had borrowed from work. He handled it with the same caution he would have given to fragile machinery, making sure it could not shift or scrape during the drive. Every movement felt deliberate, as though he were preparing to transport something far more valuable than a simple metal figure. The facility where Daniel worked was located on the edge of the city in a low gray building surrounded by warehouses. It was the kind of place Michael had passed many times without noticing. Inside, however, it felt strangely familiar, filled with tools, machines, and the quiet efficiency of people who solved technical problems for a living. The smell of oil and electronics reminded him of his own workplace, and that familiarity calmed him slightly. Daniel greeted him at the entrance with an easy smile. They had not seen each other in years, yet the old comfort between them returned quickly. Michael appreciated that Daniel did not ask too many questions. He simply led him through a series of corridors into a small room lined with equipment that looked far more advanced than anything Michael had ever used. The scanning area was dim and cool, lit only by the glow of monitors and indicator lights. A large imaging machine stood in the center, its surfaces clean and precise. Michael felt suddenly aware of how serious the situation had become. What had started as a private curiosity was now unfolding in a professional environment designed for uncovering hidden truths. Daniel explained the process in simple terms. The machine would send controlled rays through the statue and create detailed images of its internal structure. It would not damage the object in any way, and within minutes they would know whether the base contained anything unusual. Michael listened carefully, nodding even though he already understood the basic idea. What mattered was not the technical explanation, but the reality that the moment he had imagined so many times was finally here. They placed the statue on a small platform and secured it so it would not move. Michael watched as Daniel adjusted settings and prepared the machine. For a brief second, he considered stopping the whole process, packing up the statue and walking away from the mystery forever. The thought passed as quickly as it came. He had gone too far to turn back now. When the scan began, the room filled with a low mechanical hum. On the monitor beside them, a dark image slowly took shape, layer by layer, revealing the inside of the statue in ghostly shades of gray. At first, Michael could make little sense of what he was seeing. The upper portion appeared solid, just as expected, with the thin internal supports typical of cast metal objects. Then the image reached the base. Michael leaned forward instinctively, his heart beating faster. The screen clearly showed that the bottom section was not solid at all. Inside the heavy exterior shell was an empty space, carefully shaped and perfectly enclosed, and within that space lay something else. Daniel adjusted the contrast and enlarged the image. The outlines became sharper, unmistakable. There was a small rectangular container positioned neatly in the center of the hollow compartment. Around it were several thin, flat objects stacked one on top of another. Even without understanding exactly what they were, Michael recognized their shape immediately. Paper. The realization washed over him with a force he had not expected. All his suspicions, all his quiet theories were suddenly confirmed in a single silent image. The statue truly did contain a hidden compartment, and that compartment was not empty. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The machine continued its steady work, producing clearer and clearer views from different angles. Daniel rotated the statue carefully and ran additional scans, each one revealing more detail. The rectangular container appeared to be made of metal, sealed tightly, perhaps to protect its contents from moisture and time. The thin objects around it looked like folded documents or photographs, arranged with deliberate care. Michael felt as though he were standing at the edge of a door that had been locked for decades, finally able to see the shape of what lay behind it. The emotions that followed were complicated. There was excitement, of course, but also a deep, uneasy respect for the unknown story hidden inside that small space. Daniel broke the silence first, his voice thoughtful. He remarked that whoever had created the compartment had known exactly what they were doing. The interior was designed to hold those items securely, preventing them from shifting or being damaged. It was not the work of an amateur hiding something on a whim. It was planned, precise, and intentional. Hearing those words made Michael think once more of his grandparents. He imagined them younger, standing over this very statue, carefully sealing away whatever secrets it contained. He wondered how many times they had looked at it and remembered what was hidden inside. The image filled him with a mixture of admiration and sadness. They continued examining the scans for nearly an hour. Each new image strengthened the same conclusion. The compartment was real, and it held something important. There were no signs of weapons, no suspicious shapes that suggested anything dangerous. Everything pointed toward documents, carefully preserved and deliberately concealed. When the session finally ended, Michael thanked Daniel with genuine gratitude. He offered to pay for the service, but Daniel refused, saying he was simply glad to have helped with such an unusual project. As they shook hands at the door, Daniel wished him luck, and added that whatever was inside, it clearly mattered enough for someone to hide it very well. Driving home with the statue once again beside him, Michael felt the world around him differently than before. The city streets, the passing cars, the ordinary rhythm of the day all seemed slightly distant. In his mind he had kept seeing the image from the monitor, the small metal container resting quietly inside its hidden chamber. Now that he knew the truth, the situation had changed completely. Before, he had been chasing a possibility. Now he was facing a fact. The statue held something real, something his grandparents had chosen to protect. Ignoring it was no longer an option. At the same time, the discovery brought new fears. Opening the compartment would no longer be a simple act of curiosity. It would be the beginning of something he could not predict. What if the documents revealed family secrets he was not prepared to learn? What if they involved other people who did not want the past uncovered? The questions multiplied faster than he could answer them. That evening, he placed the statue back on the table and studied it with new eyes. It looked exactly the same as it always had, calm and dignified, offering no hint of the secret it carried. Yet, Michael could no longer see it as an object. It had become a vessel, a guardian of stories waiting patiently for decades to be told. He thought about calling a lawyer or a historian before doing anything further. Perhaps that would have been the safest course. But another part of him felt strongly that the first step belonged to him alone. This was his inheritance, left in his care by people who had trusted him, even if they had never said so openly. Late into the night, he sat beside the statue, weighing his options. The scans had shown him the shape of the truth, but not the truth itself. To reach that, he would have to open the base and face whatever lay inside. There would be no more guessing, no more imagining, only reality. Before going to bed, he wrapped the statue once again in its cloth and set it gently on the shelf. For the first time since bringing it home, he did not feel confused or uncertain. He felt prepared. The next step would require patience and care. The seal that had protected the compartment for so many years would not surrender easily, but Michael knew now that it could be opened. And once it was, the quiet mystery of his grandparents' lives would finally begin to speak. As he turned off the lights, he understood one simple, undeniable truth. The statue had been hiding its secret long enough. The time had come to bring it into the open. Knowing the truth was one thing, acting on it was another. After the scan, Michael no longer wondered whether the statue held a secret. He had seen the evidence with his own eyes. The hollow compartment, the carefully arranged objects, the sealed metal container, all of it was real. Yet that knowledge did not make the next step easier. If anything, it made it more intimidating. For several days, he did nothing at all. The statue remained on its shelf, silent and unchanged, while Michael tried to decide how to proceed. Opening the base would be an irreversible act. Once the seal was broken, there would be no way to return to the safe uncertainty he had lived with before. Whatever was hidden inside would become part of his life, whether he wanted it or not. He understood now why his grandparents might have hesitated for so long. Protecting a secret was simpler than confronting it. Still, he knew he could not leave things as they were. The images from the scan had made that impossible. Each time he passed the shelf, he imagined the unseen papers resting patiently in the darkness, waiting for someone to free them. The responsibility felt personal, almost heavy in his hands. When he finally decided to act, he approached the task with the same methodical care he brought to every complicated problem at work. If he was going to open the statue, he would do it properly. There would be no rushing, no careless prying, no sudden force that might damage what lay inside. The first step was preparation. Michael cleared his dining table completely and turned it into a small temporary workspace. He covered the surface with a thick protective mat and arranged his tools with careful precision. From his job, he borrowed soft clamps, fine metal picks, and a small adjustable heat gun designed for delicate repairs. He bought protective gloves, gentle solvents, and several soft cloths. He even placed a camera on a tripod to record the entire process, just in case he later needed proof of how everything had been handled. It occurred to him that he was treating the statue less like an object and more like a fragile piece of history. Perhaps that was exactly what it had become. Before touching anything, he studied the base again under bright light, examining the seam with renewed attention. Now that he knew what was hidden inside, every detail seemed more meaningful. The hardened adhesive along the line had darkened over the years, forming a barrier that looked almost like part of the metal itself. Whoever had sealed it had intended for it to remain sealed for a very long time. Michael began cautiously, warming the area around the seam with gentle heat. He remembered reading that old adhesives often softened slightly when exposed to controlled warmth. The heat gun hummed softly in his hand as he moved it slowly around the base, careful not to overdo it. He did not want to risk warping the metal or damaging the contents hidden within. For a long time, nothing seemed to change. The seam remained stubborn and unyielding. Michael worked patiently, pausing often, testing the surface with a thin tool, then applying a little more warmth. The process was slow and repetitive, requiring more patience than skill. More than once he considered giving up for the day, but something kept him going. As the hours passed, he began to feel the faintest difference. The adhesive softened just enough to allow the edge of a fine pick to slide a fraction of a millimeter deeper into the seam. It was a small victory, almost invisible, yet it filled him with a cautious hope. He switched to a mild solvent recommended for old resins, applying it carefully with a cotton swab along the warmed seam. The smell was sharp but not unpleasant, and he worked in short intervals, giving the chemical time to do its work. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the hardened barrier began to weaken. At one point, the tool slipped from his fingers and left a tiny scratch on the underside of the base. Michael froze, his heart jumping with sudden fear. The last thing he wanted was to damage something irreplaceable. He took a long breath, reminded himself to slow down, and adjusted his approach. From that moment on, he treated the task with even greater respect. By late afternoon, he had managed to create a thin opening all the way around the circular seam. It was still far from breaking free, but the seal no longer felt like solid stone. The statue rested on the table surrounded by tools and cloths, looking almost as though it were undergoing surgery. Michael paused to rest his tired hands and studied what he had accomplished. The work was delicate, frustrating, and strangely emotional. Each careful movement felt like a conversation with his grandparents, as if he were asking permission to go further. He wondered how many years had passed since someone last touched this seam. Decades, certainly. Perhaps longer. When evening came, he resumed the process, alternating between gentle heat and patient pressure. At last, after what felt like endless repetition, he heard a soft, almost inaudible sound, a faint crack like the breaking of dried glue. His breath caught. He applied a little more warmth and tried again. This time, the upper portion of the base shifted ever so slightly in his hands. The movement was minimal, but it was real. The seal was finally given way. With extreme care, he worked his way around the circle, loosening it bit by bit. The effort demanded steady concentration. Sweat formed on his forehead despite the cool air of the apartment. He felt as though he were standing on the edge of something important, afraid to make a single careless mistake. Then, without drama and almost without resistance, the base separated. The top portion lifted free, revealing the interior cavity that he had already seen on the scan. For a long moment, Michael did not move at all. He simply stared at the open compartment, hardly believing that he had actually reached this point. Inside, just as the images had shown, lay a small metal capsule wrapped carefully in aged fabric. Around it were several thin bundles of paper, yellowed at the edges but remarkably well preserved. The air that escaped from the cavity carried a faint scent of old dust and time. Michael felt a sudden rush of emotion so strong that he had to sit down. All the doubts, the questions, the long nights of wondering had led to this quiet, fragile scene on his table. The secret his grandparents had guarded for so many years was finally visible. He put on clean gloves before touching anything, determined to handle the discovery with the respect it deserved. Slowly, almost reverently, he reached inside and lifted out the fabric-wrapped capsule. It was heavier than he expected, cool and solid in his palm. The small bundles of paper came next. He placed them carefully on a soft cloth, afraid that even a rough touch might cause them to crumble. They had been protected well, but age was a powerful force. For several minutes, he did nothing more than look at what he had found. Part of him wanted to open the capsule immediately, to tear into it and learn everything at once. Another part urged patience. He had already come this far without rushing. There was no reason to change that now. He set the capsule aside and focused first on the papers. Unfolding the first sheet felt almost like stepping back in time. The handwriting was faded but clear, written in careful, deliberate strokes. The paper was thick and slightly brittle, yet still intact. Michael recognized at once that these were not casual notes or personal letters. They were formal documents, preserved with obvious care. As he examined them more closely, he realized that what he held in his hands was far more significant than anything he had imagined. Names, dates, and official-looking seals appeared on several pages. Old photographs slipped from between folded sheets, showing unfamiliar faces and places he did not recognize. A small leather-bound notebook lay among the papers, its cover worn smooth from years of handling. Michael felt a chill run through him. Whatever this collection represented, it was not a simple family keepsake. It was something organized, something purposeful. The kind of material people hid only when they believed it needed to be protected at all costs. He thought again of the way his grandparents had guarded the statue, refusing to let anyone come close to it. For the first time, he understood that their behavior had not been strange at all. It had been deliberate, necessary. The realization filled him with a mixture of pride and sorrow. Long after midnight, Michael remained at the table, carefully sorting what he had uncovered. He photographed each item before moving it, creating a record just in case anything happened. The process was slow and respectful, guided by instinct more than knowledge. By the time he finally leaned back in his chair, exhausted but wide awake, he understood one undeniable truth. Opening the base had not ended the mystery. It had only just begun. For a long time after opening the base, Michael simply sat at the table and stared at what he had uncovered. The statue rested beside him like an empty shell, no longer hiding anything. In front of him lay the small collection of objects that had been protected for decades. The metal capsule, the folded papers, the old photographs, and the worn leather notebook seemed ordinary at first glance. Yet he knew that they were anything but ordinary. They had been hidden deliberately, sealed away with care, and guarded by his grandparents for reasons he was only beginning to understand. He did not rush. Something about the moment demanded patience. Instead of tearing through the materials with reckless excitement, he forced himself to slow down and treat each item with respect. He washed his hands again, put on fresh gloves, and cleared more space on the table so he could examine everything properly. The camera on the tripod continued to record, capturing every movement. Michael wanted a clear record of what he found, not only for his own memory, but in case the discovery ever needed to be explained to someone else. The first step was simple organization. He arranged the papers into small groups according to size and appearance. Some were folded neatly, others placed inside thin envelopes that had grown brittle with age. A few were tied together with faded string. He worked carefully, afraid that even a careless motion might tear something beyond repair. The photographs caught his attention first. They were small and black and white, the kind taken with old cameras long before digital images existed. The people in them were unfamiliar to Michael. He saw men and women standing in front of modest houses, groups gathered beside trains, children posing awkwardly in Sunday clothes. None of the faces belonged to his family, yet they had been preserved as though they mattered deeply. Turning one photograph over, he discovered faint writing on the back. A name, a date, and a location were written in careful, steady handwriting. The style was old-fashioned, formal, almost cautious. As he examined more of the pictures, he found similar notes on several of them. Each one seemed to document a person or a moment that someone had considered important enough to remember. Michael felt a strange sense of responsibility growing inside him. These were not random images. They were fragments of real lives. Next, he turned his attention to the folded documents. Opening the first sheet made his breath catch slightly. The paper was thick and textured, clearly very old. Across the top ran official-looking language, and beneath it lines of precise handwriting. Names appeared again and again, along with addresses and dates. Some pages carried small stamped marks that looked like seals from organizations or institutions. At first, he struggled to understand what he was reading. The language was formal and filled with phrases that belonged to another time. But, as he continued, patterns began to emerge. Many of the documents appeared to be records of travel or relocation. Others looked like letters of introduction, written to help someone find assistance in a new place. A few contained detailed instructions describing routes, safe locations, and trusted contacts. Slowly, the purpose of the collection became clearer. These were not ordinary family papers. They were evidence of something organized and deliberate, something that had operated quietly behind the scenes. The more Michael read, the more he felt as though he were holding pieces of a hidden history that few people had ever known about. The small leather notebook lay at the center of everything. It was the most personal object in the cache, worn at the edges from years of handling. When Michael opened it, he discovered page after page filled with neat, methodical writing. Dates filled the margins. Short notes described meetings, movements, and names. The entries were brief and practical, written without emotion, yet they carried a quiet intensity. It did not take long for him to realize that the notebook had belonged to someone directly involved in whatever this secret network had been. Perhaps a relative he had never met, or even his grandfather in younger years. The thought made his heart beat faster. One particular page drew his attention, Beside a list of names was a short sentence written in slightly darker ink, as though added later. It spoke of helping families reach safety, of guiding people through difficult and dangerous times. The words were simple, but their meaning was powerful. Michael leaned back in his chair and tried to imagine the world in which these documents had been created. A world where people needed secret help, where ordinary citizens risked everything to protect others. He remembered stories he had learned in school about segregation and fear, about those who fought quietly for justice when the law itself had failed. Now it seemed that his own family might have been part of that hidden struggle. The idea filled him with a deep and unexpected pride. He turned at last to the metal capsule, the object that had sat at the heart of the compartment. Unlike the loose papers, it felt solid and heavy, designed to survive time. A small clasp held it shut, stiff with age but not locked. Michael hesitated before opening it, aware that whatever lay inside might be the most important discovery of all. With careful hands, he released the clasp and lifted the lid. Inside were several more documents, folded tightly and wrapped in thin protective material. These papers were even older than the rest, their edges fragile and darkened. When he unfolded the first sheet, he immediately understood why it had been given special protection. The document was official in every sense of the word. Elegant handwriting filled the page, accompanied by signatures and seals that looked unmistakably authentic. The language spoke of agreements, of promises made long ago between people whose names history had largely forgotten. Michael read slowly, his eyes widening as the meaning became clear. What he held was not simply a letter or a record. It was something far more significant. The document described ownership of land, large areas of it, granted under conditions that had apparently been ignored or forgotten over the years. The names of local leaders appeared beside the names of representatives from native communities. Dates from the 19th century marked the pages, placing the agreement in a distant and troubled era. Michael felt a chill run through him as he realized the implications. If these papers were genuine, they represented more than family history. They were evidence of promises broken and rights stolen. They suggested that entire communities might have been built on foundations that were never legally secure. He set the document down carefully, almost afraid to touch it again. The rest of the capsule contained supporting materials, maps drawn by hand, letters discussing the agreement, and notes that seemed to explain how the papers had been lost or taken. The story that unfolded from those pages was one of betrayal and silence. According to the records, the original treaty had vanished under suspicious circumstances many years ago, allowing powerful people to claim land that did not belong to them. Michael understood then why his grandparents had hidden everything so carefully. Possessing such documents would have been dangerous. Revealing them at the wrong time could have brought serious consequences. He imagined his grandfather discovering the truth decades earlier and making the difficult decision to protect it in secrecy. Perhaps he had hoped that one day the right moment would come to reveal it. Perhaps he had simply wanted to keep it safe until someone he trusted could decide what to do. That someone, Michael realized with sudden clarity, was now him. The weight of that responsibility pressed heavily on his shoulders. For hours he continued reading, sorting, and trying to piece together the full story. The more he studied the materials, the more convinced he became that they were authentic. The details matched known historical events. The names appeared in public records he was able to check quickly online. Nothing about the collection felt fabricated. By the time the night grew late, Michael felt as though he had stepped into another world. The quiet life he had always known seemed far away compared to the dramatic history unfolding on his table. He thought of the people in the photographs, of the families whose names filled the pages, and of the courage it must have taken to fight for justice in such uncertain times. He also thought of his grandparents, who had carried the secret for so long. Their strictness, their silence, their fierce protection of the statue suddenly made sense. They had not been guarding an object. They had been guarding the truth. As he carefully placed the documents back into protective folders, Michael understood that his discovery could not remain a private matter. These papers belonged to more than his family. They belonged to history itself. But he also knew that revealing them would not be simple. Powerful interests might still be connected to the past. People might prefer that certain stories remain buried. The decision of what to do next would require wisdom and courage. When he finally turned off the light and prepared for bed, Michael felt both exhausted and strangely energized. The mystery of the statue had been solved, yet a much larger mystery had taken its place. He had opened a door into a forgotten chapter of the past, and now he would have to decide how to walk through it. Lying awake in the darkness, he realized that his life had changed forever. The inheritance left to him was not merely a piece of metal or a handful of old papers. It was a legacy of truth, waiting for someone brave enough to bring it into the light. For several days after discovering the contents of the capsule, Michael lived in a strange state of suspended reality. The documents lay carefully organized in protective folders on his dining table, and every time he looked at them he felt the same mixture of awe and unease. He had uncovered something important, something far larger than himself, yet he had no clear idea what to do with it. Knowledge, he was learning, carried its own kind of burden. The first impulse he felt was to keep everything hidden, just as his grandparents had done. Their caution now made perfect sense. If these papers truly proved what they seemed to prove, then they could shake foundations that had been considered solid for generations. Entire properties, businesses, even neighborhoods might be connected to land taken under false pretenses. The thought was overwhelming. But another part of him knew that silence was not the right answer. Whatever dangers might exist, the truth deserved to be known. The people whose names filled those pages deserved to be remembered. And the promises recorded so carefully on fragile paper deserved to be honored, even if honoring them would be difficult. Michael understood that he could not handle this alone. He began by doing what came most naturally to him, researching carefully and quietly. He spent evenings reading about land treaties, historical injustices, and the long legal battles that often followed such discoveries. He learned how documents were authenticated, how archives preserved evidence, and how historians reconstructed forgotten stories from scattered fragments. The more he read, the more he realized how complex the situation truly was. One evening, he made a list of people who might be able to help. Historians, archivists, legal experts, and museum professionals all came to mind. He hesitated to reach out at first, afraid of being dismissed or, worse, attracting unwanted attention. Yet he knew that professional guidance was essential. These papers could not remain locked away in his apartment forever. After careful consideration, he contacted a local university and asked to speak with someone in the history department who specialized in 19th century American history. His message was cautious and vague. He explained only that he had inherited a collection of old documents that might be historically significant and needed advice on how to proceed. To his surprise, he received a response almost immediately. A professor named Dr. Elaine Harper agreed to meet with him the following week. She was known for her work on land rights and Native American treaties, exactly the kind of expertise Michael hoped for. The days leading up to the meeting felt longer than they should have. He rehearsed in his mind what he would say, how he would explain the strange path that had led him to this moment. When the day arrived, he packed the most important documents carefully into a secure folder and drove to the university with nervous anticipation. The campus felt both welcoming and intimidating, filled with young students and grand old buildings that carried the weight of tradition. Dr. Harper's office was lined with books from floor to ceiling. She greeted him with warm professionalism and invited him to sit. Michael felt his nerves easing slightly in her calm presence. He began by telling her the story of the statue, the sealed compartment, and the materials he had found inside. As he spoke, he watched her expression shift from polite interest to focused attention. When he finally placed the documents on her desk, she handled them with the same care he had learned to use himself. She examined the seals, the handwriting, and the aged paper with practiced eyes. For a long time, she said nothing, studying each page in silence. At last, she looked up at him and said, quietly, that what he had brought appeared to be extremely important. She could not make a final judgment without further analysis, but her initial impression was that the materials were authentic and potentially groundbreaking. Hearing those words made Michael feel both relieved and frightened. Dr. Harper explained that verifying the documents would require careful examination by specialists. Ink analysis, paper dating, and comparison with existing historical records would all be necessary. She asked whether Michael would be willing to allow the university to study the collection under controlled conditions. He agreed without hesitation. He had already decided that the truth mattered more than personal ownership. Over the following weeks, the process of authentication began in earnest. Experts examined every detail, cross-referencing names and dates with known archives. Maps found in the capsule were compared to historical land surveys. Handwriting specialists studied the signatures to confirm their legitimacy. Each new report strengthened the same conclusion. The documents were genuine. As the reality of that fact settled in, Michael began to understand the full scope of what he had uncovered. The treaty at the heart of the collection was not a minor agreement. It concerned vast areas of land that had since become towns, farms, and commercial districts. According to the original terms, ownership had been granted to local native communities under specific protections that were later ignored. Somewhere along the way, the treaty had vanished, allowing others to claim control illegally. The papers hidden inside the statue appeared to be one of the few surviving records of that truth. Dr. Harper warned him gently that such discoveries often created controversy. Legal claims might be reopened. Long-settled assumptions could be challenged. Powerful interests might resist any attempt to revisit the past. Michael listened carefully, understanding more clearly than ever why his grandparents had chosen secrecy. Still, he did not regret his decision. News of the authentication spread quietly among scholars, and soon other experts became involved. Historians from different institutions reached out to offer assistance. Archivists helped preserve and digitize the fragile materials. Piece by piece, the forgotten story began to emerge from the shadows. Michael attended several meetings where the documents were discussed in detail. Sitting among professionals who spoke passionately about history and justice, he felt out of place at first. He was not an academic or a lawyer. He was simply a man who had inherited a strange statue. Yet, everyone treated him with respect, recognizing that without his persistence, none of this would have come to light. As the investigation deepened, unexpected connections appeared. Some of the names in the notebook matched families still living in the region. Descendants of people mentioned in the papers were contacted and invited to share their own histories. Stories that had been passed down quietly through generations suddenly found confirmation in official records. Michael attended one such gathering at a small community center. Listening to elderly men and women speak about their grandparents and great-grandparents, he felt the weight of the past in a way he never had before. The documents he had found were not abstract pieces of paper. They were threads connecting real human lives. Yet, alongside the growing sense of purpose came new tensions. Not everyone welcomed the revelations. Rumors began to circulate that certain businesses and property owners were concerned about what the treaty might mean for them. Michael received a few polite but pointed inquiries asking whether he intended to sell the documents privately or keep them out of the public eye. He declined each offer, feeling increasingly protective of the truth he had uncovered. One evening, he returned home to find an unfamiliar car parked across the street from his building. It drove away slowly when he approached. He told himself it was probably nothing, but the incident left him uneasy. The idea that someone might prefer the past to remain hidden no longer seemed far-fetched. Dr. Harper advised him to be careful and to keep detailed records of all communications. The university helped arrange legal counsel to ensure that the documents were handled properly and protected from any attempts at suppression. Michael was grateful for the support, yet he could not shake the feeling that he had stepped into a world far more complicated than he had ever imagined. Through it all, he continued to think about his grandparents. He imagined them younger, discovering these same papers and realizing the danger they represented. Their choice to hide the treaty inside the statue now seemed less like secrecy and more like quiet courage. They had protected the truth until the time was right for it to be revealed. And that time, it seemed, had finally arrived. As the chapter of authentication drew to a close, a clear path forward began to take shape. Plans were made to present the findings publicly, to place the documents in a secure archive, and to allow further research that might help correct the injustices of the past. Michael felt both proud and overwhelmed by the role he had played. One afternoon, after leaving another long meeting at the university, he sat alone in his car and reflected on how much his life had changed. A few months earlier, he had been an ordinary man with ordinary concerns. Now, he was part of a story that stretched back more than a century. The statue that had once seemed like a simple family heirloom had become the key to a forgotten truth. Yet, even as progress was made, Michael sensed that the most difficult decisions still lay ahead. Bringing the past into the open would not be easy. There would be resistance, debate, and perhaps conflict. But he also knew that hiding the truth again was no longer possible. Driving home that evening, he felt a quiet determination settle over him. Whatever challenges came next, he would face them. His grandparents had trusted him with this responsibility, even if they had never said so aloud. Now it was his turn to honor that trust. The search for historical truth had only just begun, and Michael understood that he would see it through to the end, no matter where it led. The months that followed the authentication of the documents passed in a steady rhythm of meetings, preparations, and careful decisions. What had begun as a private discovery in Michael's apartment had grown into something far larger than he could have imagined. The university formed a small committee to oversee the next steps. Archivists prepared to preserve the materials permanently. Lawyers advised on how to present the findings responsibly. And throughout it all, Michael found himself at the center of a story that no longer belonged only to him. He often thought back to the quiet moment when he had first opened the base of the statue. At the time, he had felt alone with his discovery, uncertain and afraid. Now he was surrounded by professionals who treated the documents with the seriousness they deserved. The weight he had carried by himself was gradually shared, and that made it easier to breathe. Yet the responsibility never fully left his shoulders. Dr. Harper explained to him that revealing historical truths required more than simply presenting evidence. It required sensitivity to the communities involved, respect for the descendants of those affected, and careful consideration of the legal implications. The treaty at the heart of the collection was not just an old piece of paper. It was a living issue with the potential to influence real people and real places. Together, they planned a public announcement that would introduce the discovery without sensationalism. The goal, Dr. Harper said, was not to create conflict but to open an honest conversation about the past. Michael appreciated that approach. He had no desire to become the center of controversy. He only wanted the truth to be treated with fairness. The day of the official presentation arrived on a bright spring morning. Reporters, historians, and members of local Native communities gathered in a lecture hall at the university. The atmosphere was both serious and hopeful. For many of those present, the documents represented more than historical interest. They were pieces of a story that had shaped their families for generations. Michael sat near the front, listening as Dr. Harper explained the process of discovery and authentication. When his name was mentioned, several people turned to look at him with curiosity and gratitude. He felt suddenly shy, unused to being noticed in such a way. Photographs of the treaty and related papers were displayed on a large screen, accompanied by careful explanations of their meaning. Experts described how the documents confirmed long-held oral histories and filled gaps in official records. The audience listened in respectful silence, understanding that they were witnessing the return of something important. After the formal presentation, Michael was invited to speak briefly. He had prepared only a few simple remarks. Standing at the podium, he described how he had inherited the statue, how he had found the hidden compartment, and how he had gradually realized the significance of what lay inside. He spoke not as an expert, but as an ordinary person who had stumbled into an extraordinary responsibility. When he finished, the applause felt warm and sincere. In the days that followed, the story spread quickly. Newspapers and television stations covered the discovery with headlines that emphasized justice and reconciliation. The small metal statue appeared in photographs beside the fragile papers it had protected for so long. For many people, it became a symbol of hidden truths finally brought into the light. Offers came from museums and cultural institutions requesting to display the statue and documents. Michael worked with Dr. Harper and legal advisors to choose a permanent home where they would be cared for properly and made accessible to the public. Eventually, a respected museum dedicated to civil rights and historical preservation agreed to house the collection. Watching the materials being transferred into climate-controlled cases, Michael felt a deep sense of completion. The secret his grandparents had guarded so fiercely was now safe in a different way, protected not by silence but by knowledge. The personal impact of the discovery unfolded more slowly. Letters began arriving from people whose ancestors' names appeared in the notebook. Some thanked him for helping to confirm family stories that had once seemed impossible to prove. Others shared photographs and memories of their own, adding new layers to the history he had helped uncover. Michael read each message carefully, humbled by the connections forming around him. One afternoon, he attended a small gathering organized by community leaders to honor the return of the treaty. Elders spoke about the long struggle for recognition and the pain of promises broken. Younger members listened with pride and renewed determination. Michael sat among them, feeling both like an outsider and like someone who had been unexpectedly welcomed into a larger family. During that gathering, an elderly woman approached him and took his hands in hers. She thanked him quietly, saying that his grandparents must have been brave people to protect the truth for so many years. Her words stayed with him long after the day ended. As the weeks turned into months, Michael's own understanding of his family changed. He looked through old photographs of his grandparents with new eyes, imagining the courage it must have taken to live with such a secret. Their strictness, once confusing and frustrating, now seemed like a form of protection. They had chosen to carry a heavy burden rather than risk the documents falling into the wrong hands. He wished more than ever that he could talk to them to ask why they had never spoken openly. Yet, in a way, their silence had spoken clearly enough. By leaving the statue to him, they had placed their trust in the next generation. Not everything about the aftermath was easy. Legal discussions about the implications of the treaty continued, and some people reacted defensively to the idea that long-settled arrangements might be questioned. Michael learned to navigate those tensions carefully, always reminding himself that his role was to support the truth, not to fight battles that belonged to others. There were moments when he missed the simplicity of his old life. His name appeared in articles and interviews more often than he liked. Strangers recognized him in public, but he never regretted the path he had taken. The discovery had given his life a sense of purpose he had never expected to find. One quiet evening, he returned to his apartment after a long day at the museum. The statue, now officially part of the collection, was no longer on his shelf. The space it had occupied looked strangely empty. Yet instead of feeling loss, he felt peace. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat by the window, thinking about everything that had happened since the day he inherited that small, mysterious object. What had seemed like an ordinary piece of metal had turned out to be a bridge between past and present, connecting stories that might otherwise have been forgotten forever. Michael understood now that history was not something distant and abstract. It lived in attics, in basements, in quiet family heirlooms passed from hand to hand. Sometimes it waited patiently for someone willing to ask questions and listen. The legacy he had received was not just the statue or the papers hidden inside it. It was the lesson that truth, no matter how long concealed, deserved to be uncovered. His grandparents had done their part by protecting it. He had done his part by revealing it. On a warm summer afternoon, several months after the public announcement, the museum opened a special exhibition dedicated to the discovery. The statue stood in a glass case at the center, no longer a secret guardian, but an honored artifact. Beside it lay the restored documents, carefully preserved for future generations. Michael attended the opening with quiet pride. Families walked through the exhibit reading the story, learning about the people whose names filled the old notebook. Children pointed at the statue and asked questions. Scholars took notes. Elders stood silently, absorbing the recognition that had been so long delayed. Watching them, Michael felt a sense of closure he had not known was possible. The small metal figure that had once been locked away in his grandparents' living room had finally fulfilled its purpose. It had protected a truth until the world was ready to hear it. Now that truth belonged to everyone. As the day drew to a close, Michael stepped outside the museum and looked back at the building glowing softly in the evening light. He thought about how easily he could have ignored the strange seam on the statue, how easily the secret might have remained hidden for another generation. Instead, he had chosen to look closer. And because of that choice, a forgotten chapter of history had been brought back to life. Walking home through the familiar streets, Michael felt at peace with the path his life had taken. The inheritance he had received was far greater than he had ever imagined. It was a reminder that even the smallest object could carry the weight of enormous stories. In the end, the statue had been more than a mystery. It had been a promise waiting to be kept, and by uncovering its secret, Michael had helped fulfill that promise at last. If this story caught your attention, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next video. Watch the video on your screen now to continue the journey. Share this video with someone who needs to see it. And write in the comments, what city or country are you watching from?